All right, so in this presentation, I'll try to um, throw up into the inverted dark theory um, some kind of gastral fluids which can burn through the stomach and, as it were, defeat the material situation, which Judith Butler says, in a Foucauldian sense, the policies uh, now active determine in a no mean way the material situation and the material production of the society. Um, we're in a context where um, philosophic thinking has become maximally deranged. We're in a situation where the uh, strong echoes of German idealism, of uh, the Lockean tradition, of the Roman law, still are alive, but their uh, gravitational force is very weak. Um, what does that mean? It means probably uh, there's some people who are classicists. The guy that's uh, Lawrence Hemming. Lawrence Hemming, for instance, he's a philosopher, but he's also a sort of classicist. And why did they continue to try to keep our access to antiquity? I suppose, in the sense of Lawrence Hemming, maybe he's not a classical scholar. Maybe rather he's a Heideggerian. So he's sort of like a meek. Meek doesn't always mean negative. It's in its own, according to its own idol, it's supposed to be something that can rise up and defeat all the material forces. Just as modesty is supposed to be good, according to some people. Although, obviously, in the case of Trump, one couldn't accuse Trump of modesty at all. So maybe, according to Trump, modesty is, I suppose, Trump, in order to save face, would have probably claimed to be modest, would he? Or would he have to admit to being a bit of Barnum Bailey, a self-promoter? Yeah, these and other things are happening in this heavy gravity of the so-called stage. But what I want to say most of all at this, with regard to the inverted dark theory, is now, isn't there a chance that the flexibility is actually becoming open, so that the positions that are still held, which still act as though there's going to be the forces of normalcy, will reassert themselves, so almost everything still remains acting just like that. Samuel Moyn, as much as Bolton believed this is an aberration, and the forces of normalcy will then reassert themselves, and therefore everything they are studying is already determined as the right thing. But what could happen there momentarily? So if you figure, okay, there's, I don't know, 50,000 professors of philosophy, something like that, who knows? Or people with PhDs that are actively teaching, maybe graduate student instructors or whatever. Everything they're doing could be suddenly marginalized. Analytic philosophy could drop away, disappear. That's easy to think of that change, and absolutely desirable, I would say, in a certain sense. I'm not saying this book should be burned, but they should be marginalized. And then just say, we could allow a few people to study those things. That's the same as Netanyahu does when he says that the Haredi, or the Jews that say that the Torah should be the law, it's okay to have some of them, and don't even make them do military service, very contentious in Israel. But we can't. But we actually have to have the law that's accepted everywhere on the earth in some sense. The type something like that type of law. This is negotiation with reality. So yeah, maybe there should be a new settlement with reality on the claim of how important are analytic philosophers, a specific qualified form of philosophers, or philosophers who have a specific quality and want to pursue it. So I have to let me reiterate first to sort of begin. Well, first we have Roman law, but let's actually go first with Locke and then go back to Roman law when we're talking about we're trying to give different takes on what the state is, and then in order to open up the subject as a subject matter, to give enough footholds in order to take a bearing on the subject matter, just giving examples, and then you get this sense of like what we're talking about in enough way that we know like how far it's open, what the subject actually is. So we have Locke's version where he says there's a supposed fundamental rights, or however he calls them, life, liberty, and property. But we should understand here, property, what Locke means is something more like what the Roman law has meant since the days of the Doomsday Book began, the common law, because there's like 10,000 case law histories in the Doomsday Book, because they went around collecting information about property and how property is exchanged and things like that. But what we're talking about in Locke is actually property in the sense that property can mean quality. People have properties. Like, so for instance, what he's saying is you have the right to life, which basically means self-defense. You have the right to liberty, which basically means habeas corpus. In other words, the government can't hold you without charging you indefinitely, as they do did to Hai Weiwei, for instance. They disappear people in China, but in America, according to that liberal tradition, you're supposed to have a law of habeas corpus. Although, true, it may not have been speedily, as it were, followed through with on some of these ICE cases. Not sure about that. I think there's been some abuses in all likelihood of habeas corpus. But I think that has something to do with the speedy trial somehow, because otherwise it's a question of how long the period is between being locked up and then being officially given a chance to see a judge and things like that. So there's, life, liberty in that sense. And then what is property? But property really means for Locke, you have your properties, just like somebody could, just like, which is to say you may have a talent in a certain sphere. And then the idea is, the Roman law idea is that, Aristotle says we have despotic power over our body. And so to be a slave it means that somebody has despotic power over you. So what they're saying is, to be free means nobody has despotic power over you, but then also it goes to the other categories too. Self-defense means they don't have despotic power over you in another sense. And in the sense of property, it means you have your qualities or your talents or your good, the things, you have yourself. You are your property, according to Locke. And what that means is you can exploit yourself as you see fit. That's the Lockean sort of accelerated vision of man, as it were. The first accelerationist vision of Frankensteinian sort of, you have the right to self-exploitation and try to do your self-exploitation as efficiently as possible. This is the opening of this Lockean vision, which I also think it's impossible in Nick Land, again, to quarantine that and say, the part of it is the English thing, but it's not to become a universal. It's not to be forced on the rest of the world. I think it's necessarily, once you have that mania, you have to try to force it everywhere. Um, so let's look at some actual definitions. Um, the state. Oh, so this is from Hegel, which will become immediately obvious. The state in and of itself, an und für sich, or in and by itself, however you want to translate, in and of itself, is the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom, and it is an absolute end of Vernunft, reason, that freedom should be actual. So this is this sort of additional semi-controversial Edward Gantz 257 section sort of amendment to Hegel, which then the people asked whether it was intelligent students of Hegel had copied it down from a lecture, or whether it came from different supplements or that Hegel made himself, or how did this come in? Why did Gans bring this? Edward Gans, excuse me. Why did Edward Gans, the American friend Bruno Gans, did Edward Gans bring this in? Deutsches Socialist. All right, now let's look at. So what? Oh yeah, that's what I especially wanted to look at. That actually in that is. Well, I guess I just wanted to mention that the I think included in it ethical whole. Oh, ethical whole. Okay, so I guess we should just point out that the thrust of it is ethos, or sort of however, that's an ethos episteme. If you go back to the beginning of the tradition, sort of right after Plato, some people put down and say the main things in this school at Athens, in this academy, are ethikos, episteme, or the episteme seen from within, from trying to model ourselves, and physis, or physicae episteme, something like that, which means where physis means where the plants are, where you would go investigate if you wanted to try to learn about the so-called natural world. So this division is made from the beginning, so that yeah, in that sense, a lot of the dualist talk is very confused, because all the time the way we actually think, we go back and forth sort of between that ethical and natural viewpoint. It's just, that's the way we actually think. So trying to sort it out according to a formula becomes fetishistic. That's, by the way, one notion of the state, although it's sort of, there's a lot of problems from the Straussian point of view, and probably from the point of view of the truth. But as Nietzsche says, maybe the truth is in the way of our theory, and then we want to theorize differently, because that can be, the Galileo acts like there's a philosophic vacuum, this thing that Hobbes and Boyle later debated about in his inertial frame of reference idea, and then it says, oh, these things should fall at the same rate, and then that's not exactly true. There's no perfect vacuum, so far as they understand it empirically, but you can get it to look very close, a feather in a bowling ball or whatever, in a pseudo vacuum, empirical vacuum. But doesn't a little bit of difference matter? But in any case, you can lie like that, and maybe it's better to do so. Maybe it's more Knudsen, as Nietzsche would put it. and as the Nazis put it, or to Carl Schmitt in this handbook on the Nazi law, on the law of the National Socialism, under National Socialism. So you have a situation where state is taken by Durkheim to be the thing that is sort of represented. Like there was a mountain a little while ago that was given personhood somewhere, Philippines or someplace, I'm not sure. Mount Tamalpais, for instance, or Clear Lake or something, California. You have people that see the personality of a mountain or whatever, and Durkheim is calling this the totemism, where what he says is these are representing the kind of the maximal forces, which we now call the state, but that's how they were represented in those with those peoples. So that's one version of state. From a Straussian point of view, the problem is polis. There's no division between. There's a division for intelligibility, but it's not a. It's not a sort of a cardinal division or a total division. I mean, there's a notion of the ecos, or the householders and their economy, as against the public sphere, and the idiot is the one who's supposed to be ignoring the political sphere. There is that public-private distinction, I think, in the politics of Athens, like 5th, 6th, 7th century, or going back to the Pisistrati and so on. But there isn't the notion of Hobbesian notion, which is sort of like the Roman law notion of state of nature. Roman law doesn't talk about state of nature, but it talks about natural legal things according to nature. And the political state of nature, political state in Hobbes. This corresponds to this move that was made as a polemical move under Louis XIV, where Louis XIV was l'état noir and all that stuff, and then people said, "Oh, this he's made himself absolute, right?" And then they said, "No, there's something else, la society or something." You know, I don't know what the French is, but but you know, there's something that opposes the absolutist king, and that is I don't know, it's the Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaftsspaltung, I guess. So that then you could talk about sort of, as Thomas Jefferson puts it, is like when he's talking about the public house, which is not called a pub in American English, but a bar or but it's not really. That's it. That's not really it. It's see, we don't have pubs, I guess, really too much. I guess a Starry Plough in Berkeley is kind of a pub. It's kind of more, I guess if it's more family oriented, it's more like a pub. But in any case, these zones that are supposed to be so-called civil society zones that are supposed to be between the sheer private association and service, as in military service. Military service, you're supposed to obey any lawful order, and you must obey it immediately. Otherwise, you're no longer part of the military. Um, I don't. I mean, I make no. I guess the comment there is that the swiftness of execution of matters of military logistics are such that you couldn't. You would have. How would you know which? You would have to know in advance which order you were going to refuse, having already studied it. So I suppose if people study in advance many cases, then they can know I'm not going to accept this in this exact case. These circumstances, I will refuse the order. Otherwise, you have to accept the order immediately. But then the problem comes in most actual cases of receiving an order, you cannot know what the what's known by everyone else. You can't know what's known by everyone else in the whole chain. You're not that part of the four-horse carriage. If there's to be military, I don't see how one can really talk about. It's very difficult to really talk about lawful order versus non-lawful order. It makes. I think there's probably many cases, such as like Zizek's case of the handshake, where he just continues to shake the hand and doesn't release the hand after a certain minimal time. And then it seems like in the sense that seems wrong. There could be cases in a military situation where you think something's wrong with this man, or something's wrong with this commander, and then you say that it's not a lawful order. There could be so I think the distinction has some sense, but it's difficult to see where it has sense. It probably has sense with a sense of non-capacity or something like that. I think it has much less sense with respect to the individual warrior knowing in advance, having proved to themselves in advance certain scenarios that they're going to refuse the order. That's hard to make. It's hard to believe that makes sense because each situation is different. But this I just speak from the point of view of sort of Strauss's version of natural law, which is Cicero's version. Just trying to say are there things like that we could say that there could be no disagreement about because they're on such a concrete ground? Just as one might say in a vote, the person who gets more votes should win, although that's not the case in the first Trump victory, where I think he lost by 3 million votes because of the Electoral College rule on the vote. Okay, let's look at, having looked at this Hegelian version, which hangs around trying to show us how materially built up the self under different situations comes into the heimat, or the closeness, the nearness, the indernea of the true way of life. And Hegel tries to account for that by showing this sort of conflict of different cultures, declaring the Europeans the first culture to have gone above all cultures. That's the interesting thing. That's not. I'd say Mishima fully proves that it's true. Mishima fully proves that Hegel is right on that thing. And I think this is a problem with Dugin that we have to grapple with Dugin, because so Mishima says first with Admiral Perry, then with World War II, the Japanese were forced to look at themselves in the American mirror. And then not only he, but top Japanese scholars say this is the moment when we stopped to be the monoculture and we became part of one of the polyculture. So I mean, when Dugan speaks of the, in a certain sense, he already admits it by giving his theories in the form of the way Wallerstein would give the way who's the teacher of Fukuyama who wrote the Clash of Civilizations. The way the author of the Clash of Civilizations would present it, something like that. He seems to be like the godfather figure of all these so-called neocons. I mean, even Robert Kagan is sometimes called the neocon. I say even Robert Kagan because he's not really a neocon. He's somebody who's just regarded his position as very realistic, I think. Although he's surrendered it in the inverted dark moment, I believe, because he said that now everything's been reversed. Now it's been shown that the material situation as produced by is so much produced, confirming Foucault and Butler, by the political will, that Trump coming in means there's no longer a unipolar polarity. It simply no longer exists. So the rug's been pulled out from under Kagan, and being a realist, he's admitted it. So that's good. I mean, that shows that he's good, he's wise. Now let's look at this Weberian definition, if I can find it, to show the great change. Because, I mean, by seeing the distinction between Hegel's, where we're still getting we're pointing at ethics, where ethics and physics are the two main fields of study for the ancients, along with logos. Let's see. Okay, so let's try to get to this. Wirtschaft and Gesellschaft, so economy and society, book by Weber. A compulsory political association with continuous operations, politischer Anstaltstrieb. Will, the word will is soul, as in das Sollen, as in Kant, the art, will be, which Weber is following Nietzsche in the way he understands it, be called a state. Following Nietzsche, by which I mean he's seen what Nietzsche means, and then he's, according to Strauss, sanitized it and then put it in a form that the university can accept it. Be called a, in scare quotes, state, insofar as its administrative staff successfully upholds the claim to the monopoly. So he actually uses this word, monopol, in German, the same word. It's sort of absurd. Monopoly of, so he used the economic term to describe the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. So I think especially interesting is, so President Sunday presented this version rather than the typical one, which I noticed it has this interesting German difference, is that he talks about in this one, but not in the one more frequently cited, he talks about the politischer Anstaltstrieb. So Trieb, of course, is the usual word for drive or instinct that came in when the people like Ernst Haeckel made Darwin's evolutionary theory so powerful in the German-speaking countries. It's the word for drive. So, I mean, Weber's talking in the wake of the first power of that gave birth to people like Freud and so on, of Darwin in the German-speaking universities in Vienna and so on, in Berlin. But he's still not that far away from it. A state, insofar or as its administrative staff successfully upholds the claim to a monopoly with general use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. So I think it's interesting to consider this whole thing. So one, I mean, it sort of points to a bureaucratic state, dark state, whatever. Bureaucracy came into use in the sort of time before the 1789 revolutions, the North Atlantic revolutions of the late 18th century. The notion of bureaucracy came into play. Of course, the Americans didn't call their secretary of state rather than bureau of state. They referred to the office. But in any case, it's still a bureaucracy. I mean, that's the issue with the all these Byron Angle stuff, all this stuff connected to the U.S. aid and all this stuff. By the way, I'm not personally, I don't think, I think probably Bill Gates, I don't know, I don't have any problem with him. I think probably he's been trying to do good stuff and so on. And I think U.S. aid probably did good things in some ways, but it's basically a part of the total armature of the CIA. So it's like, yeah, of course you want so-called soft power, why not? And of course that's that notice in connection somehow to the Kennedy assassination, where they mention, there's this conspiracy theory where people are saying we, the CIA, are responsible for the conspiracy theory. What should we tell people when they talk to us this way in South America? I believe basically that's what the statement says. Conspiracy theory had been a term long in use, stemming from Karl Popper, from this book on the enemies, on the enemies of the open society, which dominated the Americans right after the war, and all the universities read that. It was read everywhere. So you have a situation where we have to ask, what is the notion of the state now empowered, but how did it get there? So part of how it got there is from this change in from the ethical definition to this version, which involves the Anstaltstrieb. So we just went on a little nice path. I'm trying to look at what a trieb is. Instinct. How did they say that at the supermarket aisle? The sudden buy, stimulated by something being at eye level or something like that. The impulse. Drive, as in Freud's death drive or Todestrieb, I think it is. Or drive as in the writer Heinrich Heine. He talks about he defines the romanticism as Trieb nach unendlich. This infinity drive, maybe it could be translated. But the problem of the infinity drive, I think, so yeah, I think the problem of the infinity drive is the opposite of the problem of the antique situation, of the situation of being the antiquarian. That's the real problem of the classical scholar, I think, at bottom, is they could become just an antiquarian who loves their pewterware or whatever. But the other problem is the Nietzschean side of the this infinity drive, which could create the Rausch, and then one could lose oneself and then be swept away. But let's look at the other half of that word, the Anstaltstrieb. So the Anstalt is like a verbal noun, like destruction could be a verbal noun. I mean, and you could put the word "the" in front of any word, basically, and then it becomes a noun. But they call it a verbal noun for whatever reason. But and then you sort of understand it as a doing. So then it's supposed to is a verb. The Anstalt is like, it's being institutionalized, it's being instituted, it's springing up, it's the it's the institution as the guiding, sort of the thing that guides the trieb. So there's a trieb which is linked to the notion of instinct, and Weber is saying this is how we're to understand what we are as beings. We're sort of like ants, but ants we think of as more chemical, but maybe instead of the chemicals there's language. I think that's sort of what Weber thinks. And then the language creates the so-called instincts. It creates the instinct. So, for instance, but not just the language, but the language and the way it controls what happens. So, like, if you're, I think what the Roman jurists bring out quite a bit is that if you're a slave in situations where you're under despotic command, remember despotism, Aristotle says, is our own command of our own body. So if somebody's commanding you just like they command their own gestures, that's despotic rule. And if there's despotic rule, then according to the Roman law, then you have sort of, that's where the edge of the first legal personage begins, once you're free of despotic rule. So it's totally not a what despotic rule has some negotiation in it. I think even if we accept, so sort of the most powerful, agreed upon by Ursula von der Leyen, agreed upon broadly by the right wing, so far as they accept the Catholics, whoever, that there's some notion of what it means to be treated despotically, or on contrary-wise to be free or liber. And supposedly those basic rights in that tradition, in the Roman tradition, those fundamental rights, which I never understood the reason they're called individual rights. I guess just from the propaganda of saying Soviet collectivist or something. So we must be the individual ones for the individual. Something. I don't see what the real basis for it is. But the real thing is that the fundamental rights are supposed to sort of preserve the situation where there's not any despotic control, and that's supposed to be the first condition for being a legal person, or for being a free man. Otherwise, you're in some way enslaved. Um, but the condition where, um, what Judith Butler says, in fact, if it's true that through the political system, what's actually produced, and then how people are actually not directly, but still used despotically. So that was what the difficulty is either you say, how could you say it's not partly the creation of the government, for instance, if you admit that even if you're against it right now, there's a federal bank, and that they tried to do this supposed macroeconomic policy on it. They tried to change the level of activity in the market by quantitative easing, or whatever the new version of that is. I think they did do it the other way around too now. But although, what does that mean exactly? I don't know. They have some new version of quantitative easing. But in any case, this so-called post-Keynesian, this thing invented by the Keynesians, which it controls the Americans entirely, the notion of the so-called macro policies, which are really only a very few things, as against the theory of, as against the obviously false theory of rational demand on the market, in the sense of the diamond paradox and this type of things, in the sense of the if I have one card, the second card is worth less to me, or if I have $10, the $11 worth less than the first one was, or something. This claim that the billionaire, the $1 extra is not worth very much to them by the rational calculus, as it were. And then this is called the microeconomics. This sort of imbecility, which is in control, which is just a one way of training people alongside others. It's part of the trebe. So that's a big example. That's an example of the trebe according to the Anstalt-Trebe, the politischer Anstalt-Trebe, because the institutions, the bureaucracy of the academy has accepted those ways of training. So that's Anstalt-Trebe. So I mean, Hegel. So we could just bookend it this way: say Hegel never dreamed of sort of having this biological Anstalt-Trebe, instinctual training by the institutions and by the officers of those the trained bureaucrats version, because he's thinking in terms of ethopoiesis, and in terms of the old, it's something more in the direction of the imitatio Christio, the notion you can imitate in various ways ethical behavior. He's not thinking about controlling bodies by this Fukuyamist social psychology and so on.